a cleaning lady approached a millionaire and told him not to travel with his friend. The next morning, there was a luxury car next to her humble house. Amelia Ortega wasn't the sort of person anyone noticed. Working as a cleaning lady for high-end clients across town, her days were spent in hushed corridors and lavish rooms, dusting surfaces no one seemed to touch, vacuuming carpets thick enough to swallow her footfalls. She was in her mid-50s, with short, graying hair pulled back into a no-nonsense bun. Her hands, roughened by years of scrubbing and polishing, were calloused but capable, though the fine motor strain sometimes made her fingers ache. She'd worked at her job for nearly a decade, shifting from one mansion to another, her face blending into the background, her name often forgotten. People around her were often drawn to opulent lifestyles, always wrapped in casual elegance. Amelia could barely fathom. She was treated kindly by some, ignored by others, but mostly she felt like a fixture in the rooms she cleaned, invisible unless needed. For her, invisibility was a survival tactic in this world. In places where people wore wealth like armor, her modest uniform and quiet presence offered her the cover to stay out of sight and out of trouble. Amelia lived in a small, simple house on the outskirts of town. It was a modest home, barely big enough for herself and her small collection of potted plants, which she tended to with great care. Her neighbors were familiar with her routines and respected her space. Despite her quiet disposition, she knew the difference she made in the lives of those who saw her as more than just the help. There was Marianne, the frail widow she sometimes ran errands for on her day off, and Mr. Alvarez, the grumpy landlord who grudgingly fixed her plumbing without ever charging a dime. Amelia's life might not have been glamorous, but it had its charms. A world she was accustomed to, even if it was understated. But there was a part of her life that she kept hidden from everyone, including herself. On some nights, she'd sit alone in her little living room with only the hum of the refrigerator keeping her company, wondering if the choices she'd made were truly her own. There had been times, years ago, when Amelia had dreams larger than her world allowed, but reality had a way of quieting even the loudest ambitions. Time had softened her wishes, turning them into whispers that seemed to dissolve before they even took shape. Now her dreams were simpler, less specific, a vague hope for comfort, security, and perhaps a break from the seemingly endless days of anonymity. She was someone who had grown used to being in the background, not expecting anything remarkable to come her way. She could hardly imagine that anyone in the luxurious homes she worked in would spare a thought about her once she closed the door behind her at the end of the day. That was until the day she met Mr. Gray. The Grays' mansion was the crown jewel of her weekly cleaning rounds. Unlike the other homes, which were tastefully extravagant, the Grays' estate bordered on ostentatious. Built on the crest of a hill overlooking the city, it seemed to defy the laws of nature, all sharp lines and polished glass, with windows stretching from floor to ceiling. Inside, the space was an opulent maze of ivory and marble, adorned with expensive art pieces that Amelia dared not look at for too long, lest she feel the eyes of some curator peering over her shoulder in judgment. She'd been cleaning the Gray household for almost 2 years, and she knew the place as intimately as she knew her own home. She knew which door hinges creaked, which floorboards groaned underfoot, and which window panes would fog on chilly mornings. It was a fortress of glass and stone, a stark contrast to her tiny, warm house nestled among scruffy trees on the outskirts of the city. The wealth of her surroundings both awed and unsettled her, a constant reminder of the social chasm between her and the people who lived there. Though her work was solitary, Amelia's schedule synchronized with the lives of those in the mansion. Mr. Gray, the mansion's enigmatic owner, was a man of few words and fewer appearances. He was handsome in a detached, almost predatory way, with a perfectly tailored suit that only added to his aura of self-possession. His wealth was apparent not just in his surroundings, but in the way he moved through the world with an unshakable confidence. People seemed to gather around him instinctively, like birds circling a storm cloud. And then there was his friend, the equally wealthy and equally mysterious Lucas Moretti. Lucas was younger and undeniably charismatic, with a relaxed charm that seemed to fill a room. Amelia didn't often cross paths with him, but the times she did left a strange impression on her. He had a way of glancing at her, brief but intense, that made her feel as though he could see right through her usual invisibility. While Mr. Gray was silent and aloof, Lucas was the kind of man who could disarm anyone with a single smile. One Tuesday, Amelia arrived at the mansion in the early morning, unlocking the side entrance as she always did. The house was silent, but she could sense that tension in the air that she'd come to recognize. It was a subtle feeling, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Walking through the grand foyer with its glittering chandelier, Amelia couldn't shake the strange pressure building in her chest. She chided herself for being silly, for letting the grandeur and mystery of the place feed her imagination. However, even as she continued her work, she found herself lingering on her thoughts, feeling a weight in the air that she couldn't quite identify. As she made her way to the West Wing, she could faintly hear voices from the study. It was Mr. Gray and his friend, Lucas Moretti, their conversation a murmur punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter. Amelia knew she shouldn't listen, shouldn't even be in earshot, but something in their tone made her hesitate. It was nothing concrete, just an odd lilt in Lucas's voice, almost as if he were teasing Mr. Gray, except this was no friendly banter. There was an edge to it, a suggestion of something far less innocent. Amelia brushed the thought aside, telling herself it wasn't her business. She had a job to do, and that job did not include eavesdropping on the rich. But she couldn't shake the lingering sense that whatever it was they were talking about, it was the beginning of something she was not meant to understand. As Amelia moved further down the hall, the voices in the study grew louder. She knew better than to linger, yet the unusual tension kept her rooted in place. Something in Lucas's tone was like the edge of a knife. She realized her hands were gripping her cleaning supplies tightly, her pulse beating fast against her temples. With a small, reluctant glance around, she edged closer to the door. The low hum of their conversation turned into sharp, distinct words that seemed to bite into the air. "Look, you can't go through with it, James. You're in too deep already." Lucas's voice carried an urgency that startled her. Amelia's mind raced, piecing together fragments she barely understood. "Too deep?" Mr. Gray's voice was colder, steadier. "Since when do you worry about how far I'm in? You've never cared before." His tone held the barest hint of a threat, the type that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. "Maybe I don't," Lucas said, his tone light but barbed. "But this time, things are different. This isn't just business. You're risking a lot more than money. People are starting to ask questions, people you don't want to cross." Amelia held her breath, carefully shifting her position so she wouldn't make the slightest noise. In her many years of cleaning, she had occasionally overheard the wealthy argue, secrets slipping out when they thought no one was listening. But this was something else. There was a danger in Lucas's voice, a warning that was more than a cautionary remark between friends. A thick silence fell between the two men, broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock somewhere in the study. She felt her heart pound in her chest, but her curiosity overpowered her fear. She leaned closer. "So what do you suggest?" Mr. Gray finally asked, his voice low and curt. "Stay in town," Lucas replied without hesitation. "Just until things settle. You don't need to jet off to Singapore with the investors breathing down your neck. Handle things here first." A bitter laugh escaped Mr. Gray. "You want me to let them think I'm rattled? I can't afford that, and you know it. Letting them think you're cautious is better than letting them know you're reckless," Lucas shot back, a quiet force in his voice. "But if you want to ruin yourself, go ahead. I'm only here to give advice, not make your decisions." There was a pause, and then the unmistakable sound of footsteps, a sharp, authoritative stride headed toward the door. Amelia snapped out of her trance, turning and nearly stumbling in her haste to get back down the hallway. She ducked into a nearby alcove, her heart thundering as she pressed herself against the wall, willing herself to melt into the shadows. Mr. Gray emerged from the study, his brow furrowed and jaw set, looking as though he were preparing for battle. Amelia couldn't recall ever seeing him that way before. His usual air of cold confidence was replaced by something sharper, more dangerous. He moved quickly down the hall, his footsteps echoing in the vast empty space as he strode away. Amelia stayed frozen in the alcove, her mind reeling. There was something sinister lurking beneath that conversation, something more than just an argument over a business deal. After Mr. Gray's footsteps faded down the hall, Amelia carefully emerged from her hiding place. Her mind raced as she replayed the fragments of conversation she'd overheard, struggling to make sense of what she'd just witnessed. The tension between Mr. Gray and Lucas wasn't merely professional or personal. It seemed laden with a threat that went beyond words. Something about their exchange struck her as a prelude to danger, a warning half given and half silenced. She continued down the hallway, making her way to the next room, but her thoughts kept wandering back to the strange conversation. She knew better than to involve herself in the affairs of her wealthy employers. Her life was quiet, straightforward, cleaning rooms, keeping her head down, earning enough to get by. She wasn't supposed to be curious, let alone concerned, with matters far outside her reach. Yet a lingering sense of dread grew within her, like a cold knot in her stomach that she couldn't shake off. The last part of Lucas's words haunted her. This isn't just business, people you don't want to cross. What kind of people were they talking about? And what was it that could make Lucas, so seemingly fearless, actually sound anxious? Her mind drifted to Mr. Gray's scheduled trip the following evening. Singapore. She remembered him mentioning in passing last week, an important business venture he couldn't miss. He had spoken about it with an air of excitement, though she now wondered if it was a facade. To Amelia, Singapore was just a name, a place she couldn't locate on a map, but the way Lucas spoke about it made it sound like a journey that could lead Mr. Gray to trouble, or worse. As she moved through the rooms, her sense of urgency increased. She wanted to tell herself it wasn't her concern, that she had no business meddling in Mr. Gray's affairs. But her gut instincts, the same ones that had kept her safe and out of trouble all these years, were screaming that this was different. She knew she would struggle to forget what she'd overheard, to silence the tiny voice inside her that kept urging her to do something. What could she do? She was a cleaning lady, nothing more. But Amelia also knew she'd always had a knack for reading people, a quality that had saved her in ways large and small. People often revealed more of themselves in their homes than they realized, and she'd grown adept at picking up on their secrets. She'd seen the power, greed, and quiet desperation hidden behind the walls of mansions, the worlds of privilege often clouded by shadows invisible to the people who lived in them. By the time her shift ended, Amelia felt a deep conflict within herself. Was she about to let this go, convince herself that it was all beyond her concern? Or would she do the unthinkable, approach Mr. Gray about his friend's warning? Her thoughts felt heavy as she gathered her things and headed toward the mansion's exit. Just as she reached the door, she caught sight of Lucas standing in the driveway, leaning against his sleek sports car with a cigarette in hand. He looked pensive, his usually charming smile absent as he gazed off into the distance. Amelia hesitated, wondering if she should approach him instead, try to dig deeper without overstepping. But she knew the risks. The rich had their own codes, their own barriers, and someone like her wouldn't easily get answers. Taking a deep breath, Amelia decided she would speak to Mr. Gray the next morning. She'd give him the warning she felt compelled to share, and then leave the choice to him. She hoped he'd take her seriously, though she wasn't sure he would. As she walked down the winding path leading away from the mansion, she couldn't help but feel that she was stepping into a place far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. That night, Amelia lay in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. She replayed every word of the conversation she'd overheard, along with the wary expressions she'd seen on both men's faces. There was a hidden threat in Lucas's voice, a warning that Mr. Gray seemed determined to ignore. Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible would happen if she didn't intervene. Yet, she also couldn't shake the other, equally pressing feeling that this wasn't her place, that speaking up might do more harm than good. All her life, Amelia had been someone who avoided conflict. It was how she'd stayed employed in places that could easily cast her out if she became too familiar or too inquisitive. She kept her head down, finished her work, and never asked questions, even when she wanted to. The rich had their dramas, and she'd trained herself to look the other way. But this felt different. She had stumbled onto something real, something that seemed to ripple with danger. And for once, she wasn't sure if looking away would protect her or leave her with a sense of regret she couldn't bear. Amelia's mind went back to the countless times she'd seen Mr. Gray and Lucas over the years, moving like untouchable figures in a world she only glimpsed from the sidelines. She knew nothing about their lives beyond the surface, yet she saw the small details. How Lucas sometimes entered the house with tension written in his movements, or how Mr. Gray would stare out the window, his face drawn and serious. Over time, she'd begun to see them as more than just wealthy clients. To her surprise, she found herself caring, wondering if there was any good in those lives insulated by wealth and power. And now, with Lucas's warning echoing in her mind, she feared she'd lose them to whatever danger awaited. Yet, the idea of approaching Mr. Gray made her stomach churn. What would she say? I overheard something I wasn't supposed to. Or maybe your friend seems worried. Perhaps you should be too. Either way, it felt absurd. She imagined Mr. Gray's reaction, the way he'd likely look at her with that cold detachment, making it clear that she was stepping over a line that shouldn't be crossed. Amelia took a deep breath, trying to shake the fear clutching her. What if Mr. Gray ignored her? Worse, what if he became suspicious, saw her as an inconvenience rather than a concerned bystander? She thought of the many stories she'd heard from other housekeepers, those whispered tales of people dismissed without warning, lives changed on a whim because they'd ventured too close to secrets that weren't theirs. For hours, Amelia wrestled with her thoughts. Every sensible part of her screamed to leave it alone, to pretend she hadn't heard anything. But each time she closed her eyes, she saw Mr. Gray's determined expression and Lucas's anxious warnings. She wondered how she'd feel if something happened and she'd done nothing. In her mind, 1,000 scenarios unfurled, each ending with her haunted by regret or even guilt, the kind that would gnaw at her for the rest of her life. By dawn, Amelia hadn't slept a minute. She lay there, watching the first light creep through the thin curtains, a mixture of exhaustion and conviction settling over her. She had to try, even if it made no difference. She would speak to Mr. Gray, no matter the consequences. The next morning, Amelia dressed carefully, choosing her neatest uniform and smoothing her hair with a sense of resolve she hadn't felt in years. She left her house early, her nerves taut as she made her way to the Grays' mansion. The world seemed unusually quiet, as if holding its breath for whatever might unfold that day. With each step up the winding driveway, her heart thudded louder, echoing her determination and her fear. Inside the mansion, she went through the usual motions, though her mind was preoccupied with the words she'd finally say to Mr. Gray. The Grays were still upstairs, and the house was blissfully empty, so she forced herself to start her usual duties. She dusted statues and wiped down glass surfaces, her thoughts still churning, practicing the words over and over. Mr. Gray, I need to tell you something. Simple enough, she thought. But the anticipation gnawed at her, making the words feel heavier. She kept glancing at the clock, the minutes ticking closer to the time Mr. Gray would leave for his business trip. Her anxiety grew sharper. What if he dismissed her before she could finish? What if she couldn't find the courage to speak? Every possibility seemed to deter her, each thought twisting into an excuse to back down, to let things go. Yet somehow, she kept moving forward. Finally, the sound of footsteps echoed down the grand staircase. Mr. Gray entered the room, looking every bit the powerful businessman, dressed impeccably in a dark suit, his face unreadable. He didn't notice her at first, and she stood, gripping her cleaning cloth with white-knuckled intensity. This was it. Clearing her throat, she gathered the last bit of courage she could muster. Mr. Gray? He paused, looking at her with a mix of surprise and mild irritation, as if someone like her rarely had cause to speak to him directly. Yes? Amelia's voice felt small, but she steadied herself, speaking slowly. I overheard something yesterday, she began, between you and Mr. Moretti. At her words, a dark shadow flickered across his expression, a hint of suspicion and annoyance. His eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening. And why, may I ask, were you listening? She flushed, taken aback by the bluntness of his tone, but pushed forward. It wasn't intentional, she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. But I heard what he said. About your trip. He seemed worried, Mr. Gray. I think he was trying to warn you. A long silence filled the room, and she could see the wheels turning in his mind, assessing her, trying to gauge her motives. She felt the weight of his judgment like a physical force, the air thick between them. Finally he spoke, his voice cool and dismissive. "Thank you for your concern," he said, his tone clipped. "But my affairs are my own, Miss Ortega. I'll decide who and what is worth worrying about." The cold dismissal stung, and for a moment Amelia felt the foolishness of her decision. She'd risked everything to try to help, only to be met with indifference. She nodded, her eyes dropping to the floor, murmuring, "Of course, I only thought, if there's any danger, I'd hate to see something happen to you." But then, as she turned to go, something in his expression softened ever so slightly. He didn't speak, but his eyes held a fleeting trace of curiosity, or perhaps doubt. Amelia caught it just before he averted his gaze, the barest hint that her words might have reached him, even if he didn't want to admit it. And though he said nothing more, that tiny glimmer gave her hope. She left the room, her heart still pounding, unsure if she'd truly made a difference or simply overstepped. But at least now, she knew she'd done everything she could. Amelia returned to her work, her heart still racing, her mind filled with doubt. She'd seen something in Mr. Gray's eyes, something faint but unmistakable, that suggested he hadn't entirely dismissed her warning. But would it be enough? A cold unease settled over her as she tried to focus on her tasks, though her hands shook slightly and her thoughts continued to spiral. Barely an hour had passed when she heard the familiar rumble of a luxury car pulling up in front of the house. Curiosity, mixed with dread, pushed her to glance out the window, where she saw Lucas Moretti stepping out of his sleek black sports car. He was dressed casually, yet impeccably, his presence sharp and intense as he moved with quick, purposeful strides toward the front door. Her heart sank. What could Lucas be here for so close to Mr. Gray's departure? Moments later, she heard raised voices drifting from the foyer, where Lucas and Mr. Gray were speaking. Their tones were tense, the earlier warning conversation clearly unresolved. Amelia lingered in the hallway, her curiosity outweighing her apprehension, inching closer to hear. "What's this all about, Lucas?" Mr. Gray demanded, his voice tight with frustration. "You come here unannounced, trying to meddle in my plans? I thought we discussed this already." "It's because we discussed it that I'm here," Lucas replied, his tone equally resolute. "I'm telling you, James, this trip is a mistake. The people you're planning to meet aren't what you think. They're involved in far more than just business, and if you go—" "Enough," Mr. Gray interrupted sharply. "You're beginning to sound paranoid. You've been my friend for years, but I'm not about to let you dictate my decisions." Amelia could practically feel the tension radiating from both men, each unwilling to back down. She felt her pulse quicken, realizing how deeply they were entrenched in whatever dangerous game this was. And though every instinct told her to walk away, she found herself moving closer, drawn by a sense of urgency that she couldn't quite explain. It was as if she'd crossed an invisible line, pulled into a world she'd been content to ignore for so long. In that moment, Lucas's voice softened, taking on a tone she hadn't heard before, genuine fear. "James, I'm only saying this because I care. You're walking into a trap. These people don't play by the rules you're used to. They're ruthless, and if you're not careful, you won't come back the same man. Or maybe you won't come back at all." There was a silence, heavy and thick. For the first time, Amelia saw a flicker of hesitation cross Mr. Gray's face. He didn't respond immediately, as though grappling with the weight of Lucas's words. She felt a surge of hope, willing him to listen, to take Lucas's warning seriously. But Mr. Gray's voice eventually broke the silence, his tone firm and resolute. "I appreciate your concern, Lucas," he said, "but I know what I'm doing. I'll be fine." Without another word, he turned and strode down the hall, his footsteps echoing through the silent mansion. Lucas, left standing alone, looked frustrated, running a hand through his hair, his expression a mix of anger and resignation. Amelia's heart sank, realizing that her warning and even Lucas's pleas hadn't been enough to sway Mr. Gray. Her mind whirled, wondering if there was anything else she could do to stop him from leaving. She hadn't expected to feel so responsible, but now she did, as though failing to help would mean betraying something deep within herself. As Mr. Gray headed toward his office to make final preparations for his trip, Amelia felt a swell of panic rising in her chest. She'd done everything she could think of, everything within her power to warn him, yet her words and even Lucas's desperation seemed to roll off him like rain on glass. A resolve settled over her, a reckless courage she hadn't known she possessed. She couldn't let it end like this. Taking a deep breath, she hurried to find Lucas, who was still standing in the foyer, a look of troubled defeat shadowing his face. She approached him cautiously, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Moretti," she said, causing him to turn sharply, his eyes narrowing as he took in her presence. "I know I'm just a cleaning lady, but I overheard your conversation with Mr. Gray yesterday. And today, I tried to warn him too. He's not listening to either of us." Lucas's gaze softened slightly, and a flicker of surprise crossed his face as he looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. There was a quiet intensity in his eyes, as if he were weighing her sincerity, assessing her determination. "You're right," he murmured, almost to himself. "He won't listen to me, not this time." His jaw clenched in frustration, and he seemed to be lost in thought, as if considering some last desperate option. After a moment, he looked back at her. "Why do you care? Most people would just mind their business." Amelia didn't know how to answer that. Her life had been about surviving quietly in the background, not getting involved. But something about this situation stirred a sense of justice she couldn't ignore. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I have a feeling that if I walk away, something terrible will happen, and I couldn't live with that." Lucas studied her with a strange expression, as if trying to piece together the puzzle of why a quiet cleaning lady would care so much about the fate of a millionaire employer who likely didn't even know her name. Finally, he nodded, the decision made. "All right," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "If he won't listen to words, maybe action will convince him." He glanced toward the driveway, his mind racing. "I have a plan, but it's risky, and it might just get me in more trouble than I can handle. But maybe, with a little help, I can delay him." Amelia felt a jolt of fear mingled with excitement. She hadn't expected this, hadn't imagined that her small act of courage would draw her into something so daring. But seeing the determination in Lucas's eyes, she knew she was in this now, whether she wanted to be or not. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, the words out before she could second-guess herself. Lucas didn't hesitate. "Distract him. Whatever it takes, keep him from leaving for just a few minutes longer. I'll handle the rest." He offered her a brief, encouraging nod, as though recognizing the unusual courage it took for her to agree. Her heart raced as she made her way back down the hall, her mind scrambling to come up with something, anything, that would keep Mr. Gray occupied. As she passed his office, an idea struck her, one that was simple but effective. She knocked on the door, then pushed it open without waiting for a response, knowing the intrusion would at least unsettle him. "Mr. Gray," she said, feigning an urgent tone, "there's a problem with the back entrance. I think there might be someone outside." He looked at her with annoyance, clearly unimpressed, but something in her tone must have made him pause. He glanced out the window, suspicion crossing his face, and for just a few crucial moments, he stayed in the office, unwilling to leave until he'd seen for himself. Outside, Amelia glimpsed Lucas moving swiftly toward Mr. Gray's car, working quickly to disable it just enough to delay the trip. She felt a strange mixture of pride and relief, knowing she'd done her part. As Mr. Gray peered out the window, his irritation evident, Amelia's mind whirred with both fear and determination. This wasn't a game she was meant to play. But standing here, watching Mr. Gray's annoyed expression shift into suspicion, she couldn't shake the feeling that her decision to help had been set in motion long ago, by moments and memories she hadn't allowed herself to examine. In the tense silence, she remembered a time, years before, when her own family had been torn apart by reckless choices and dangerous associations. Her brother, Manuel, had fallen in with a crowd who promised opportunity and quick money, but all they delivered was pain and danger. Amelia had tried to warn him, just as she was warning Mr. Gray now. She'd begged Manuel to stay away, to make better choices, but he'd been too swept up in the promise of wealth and prestige to listen to the pleas of his older sister. And then came the day he didn't come home. The pain had shaped her into the quiet, cautious woman she was now. After losing Manuel, she'd lived each day with a certain distance, an invisible wall between herself and those she served. The grief had been too great, her trust too shattered. She couldn't bear to attach herself to people who might disappear or who wouldn't listen, no matter how much she cared. So she'd kept her distance, avoided connecting with those in her clients' worlds, hoping to protect herself from more heartbreak. But Mr. Gray's situation felt different, hauntingly familiar in ways that made her breath catch. Seeing his stubbornness, his unwavering belief that he could handle the situation on his own, she saw echoes of Manuel, the same determination, the same denial of danger. And even more painfully, she saw herself, watching someone she cared about slip away, risking everything for reasons they couldn't fully grasp until it was too late. The memories gnawed at her, igniting a deep-seated need to save Mr. Gray from a fate similar to her brother's. Perhaps this was her second chance, a chance to do for him what she hadn't been able to do for Manuel. She was risking her job, maybe even her safety, but something in her was too determined to stop. Her decision had a weight she couldn't ignore, the weight of past losses and the quiet hope that perhaps, this time, she could make a difference. Mr. Gray finally turned back to her, his brows knitted in impatience. "I don't see anything. Are you sure?" His tone was clipped, his annoyance barely hidden. Amelia nodded, managing to keep her voice steady. "I thought I saw movement, but maybe I was mistaken," she added. "I just thought I should alert you, given the importance of your trip." The subtle emphasis she placed on the word importance wasn't lost on him. She could see a flicker of something like acknowledgement in his gaze, as though he realized her concern, however misplaced he might consider it. Before he could respond, Lucas reappeared in the doorway, his face a calm mask, though his eyes met Amelia's briefly with a hint of gratitude. "Ready to head out?" he asked Mr. Gray, his voice casual, concealing the urgency underneath. With a last, scrutinizing look at Amelia, Mr. Gray nodded, picking up his bag. But as he took his first step, his phone buzzed, drawing his attention to a message that seemed to take him off guard. He paused, frowning down at the screen. Whatever it was, it demanded his attention, just as Amelia and Lucas had hoped. As Mr. Gray stared at his phone, his frown deepening, Amelia felt a surge of relief. The message had bought them a few more precious moments, and she silently willed him to reconsider his trip. Beside her, Lucas remained still, though she could sense the tension coiled in his posture. She felt the weight of his shared relief, but also something more, an unspoken connection between them, a shared mission. Mr. Gray finally pocketed his phone, casting a lingering look at Lucas, as though weighing his next words carefully. "I'll reschedule for tomorrow morning," he said at last, his voice low. "But that's the best I can offer. If you're worried about these associates, then I expect you to handle whatever problems you believe they pose. I'm not here to be coddled, Lucas." Lucas gave a curt nod, his usual charm tempered by the gravity of the moment. "It's not about coddling, James," he replied evenly. "It's about keeping you alive." Mr. Gray's face remained impassive, but Amelia caught a flicker of something in his expression, a realization, perhaps, of the seriousness in his friend's words. He didn't respond, turning away instead, though his usually confident steps felt slower, more deliberate. For the first time, Amelia sensed a crack in his impenetrable demeanor, a glimpse of vulnerability beneath his polished exterior. As Mr. Gray disappeared down the hall, Amelia and Lucas exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement of the risk they'd taken. The shared relief between them carried an unspoken question. Would delaying his trip by a day truly change anything? They both lingered in the grand foyer, an uncharacteristic pause for Amelia, who was usually quick to return to her work. She felt her resolve soften as Lucas turned to her, his expression a mixture of respect and curiosity. "I have to admit, I didn't expect anyone else to step in like that," he said, his tone low. "It's rare that people care enough to take a risk." Amelia glanced down, almost embarrassed, but then the words spilled out before she could stop them. "I lost someone once," she said softly, "someone who thought he was invincible. I tried to warn him, but he didn't listen." She hesitated, the old pain resurfacing, sharper than she'd expected. "I couldn't bear to stand by and watch that happen again." A long silence followed, one that felt oddly comfortable, as if they were both carrying invisible weights that the other somehow understood. Lucas nodded, his expression gentler, more open than she'd ever seen it. "Thank you," he said, the sincerity in his voice surprising her. "Not many people would have done what you did. You didn't have to, but you did." Amelia gave him a small smile, surprised at the warmth that blossomed within her at his words. She'd grown accustomed to being invisible, her efforts largely unnoticed. But today she'd made a difference, however small it might seem. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of pride, a sense of purpose beyond her quiet, everyday life. Lucas seemed to hesitate, then spoke again. "Listen, if you hear or see anything unusual while you're here." He trailed off, his eyes scanning the empty hallway, then returned to her with a steely resolve. "Let me know. There's more going on than Gray realizes, and I'm trying to keep it contained." Her breath caught. This moment, this unexpected alliance, felt like a turning point, a bridge between her past loss and this new chance to make a difference. "I will," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. In that instant, she realized that helping Mr. Gray was not just about stopping a tragedy from repeating, but about healing her own wounds, about reclaiming the part of herself that had cared, even if it hurt to lose. As Lucas departed, Amelia felt the quiet weight of the past begin to lift, replaced by a new resolve. She might have been just a cleaning lady, invisible and underestimated, but in that moment she felt something shift within her, a reawakening. Whatever happened next, she wouldn't turn away. The day wore on, but Amelia's sense of unease only deepened. Each room she cleaned seemed cloaked in shadows, each corner filled with secrets she could almost feel lurking just out of sight. Her conversation with Lucas had left her with more questions than answers, yet it was the first time someone from the Gray's world had truly seen her, trusted her enough to share in something dangerous and mysterious. She felt, for the first time, not as though she were trespassing on their lives, but actively involved in them. As evening settled, the mansion grew quiet, and Amelia found herself assigned to clean Mr. Gray's office. She worked carefully, her movements deliberate as she tidied the desk and polished the dark wood, but her curiosity tugged at her with every motion. There was a heavy, locked drawer in the corner that caught her attention. Normally, she'd ignore it, respectful of boundaries, but today, her instincts screamed otherwise. After all, if Mr. Gray was truly in danger, perhaps the answers lay here, hidden under lock and key. Taking a deep breath, Amelia hesitated, her fingers hovering over the drawer. The house was empty, and her heartbeat echoed in her ears as she gently tried the handle. To her surprise, it wasn't fully latched. As she cautiously eased it open, she found an assortment of papers, documents and contracts that looked perfectly ordinary at first glance. But buried beneath them, a single envelope caught her eye. She unfolded the letter inside and scanned its contents. Her heart sank as she read words she didn't fully understand, but which gave off a disturbing clarity. A deal was being discussed, an investment agreement involving individuals she'd only heard mentioned in dark, hushed tones. Figures rumored to have hands in dangerous circles. Names appeared that she recognized from whispers over the years, people notorious for amassing wealth through murky, underhanded channels. The letter hinted at meetings, transfers, and a pending transaction that looked like it involved something other than just business. She felt a cold realization creep over her. Mr. Gray wasn't dealing with ordinary investors. He was tangled up in something far more sinister, something woven deep into a web of corruption that she couldn't fully fathom. She carefully folded the letter, her mind racing. The conversations between Lucas and Mr. Gray started to make sense now. Lucas's frantic warnings, his emphasis on the dangers involved. This wasn't just a bad business decision on Mr. Gray's part. He was stepping into a conspiracy that could ruin him, or worse, endanger his life. And Lucas was right to be worried. These weren't people who would forgive easily if a deal went sour or if trust was betrayed. As she placed the letter back in its envelope, Amelia's hands trembled. Her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and determination. She understood now that Lucas had been trying to shield Mr. Gray from more than just a risky business endeavor. He was trying to protect him from the clutches of people who had no qualms about eliminating obstacles. Amelia realized that, intentionally or not, she was now part of this puzzle. She'd seen too much, heard too much, and a part of her feared that she was already in too deep. Suddenly, the reality of her situation struck her. She'd crossed a line from which there might be no return. But her conscience wouldn't allow her to ignore it. Not after the memories of Manuel. Not after the small but meaningful alliance she'd forged with Lucas. She closed the drawer and finished her work, determined to warn Lucas about what she'd found. With her heart hammering in her chest, Amelia finished tidying Mr. Gray's office and made her way down the grand staircase, her mind still reeling from the implications of the letter she'd found. The mansion was empty, quiet, with only the faint ticking of a clock filling the silence. As she descended, her thoughts spun with questions. How deep did this conspiracy run? And how long had Mr. Gray been involved, perhaps unknowingly? She knew she had to find Lucas. Her instincts told her that he might be her only ally in this twisted situation, the only one who both understood the danger and might know what to do next. The realization weighed heavily on her, and yet, oddly, it also brought a clarity she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't here by accident. All of her quiet observations, her years of remaining invisible and picking up on unspoken cues, had led her to this moment. For the first time, her intuition felt like a weapon instead of a shield. As she approached the driveway, she spotted Lucas near the gates, speaking on his phone with a hurried, tense expression. She hesitated, wondering if she should interrupt, but the urgency of the situation pushed her forward. When he saw her approaching, he ended the call, slipping his phone into his pocket, his sharp gaze fixed on her. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low but direct, as if he sensed that her presence carried significance. Amelia took a breath, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "Mr. Moretti, I found something in Mr. Gray's office. It's serious. I think the people he's planning to meet aren't just investors. They're involved in something dangerous. There was a letter, and—" She trailed off, struggling to find the right words to describe the heavy sense of threat the document had conveyed. Lucas's face darkened as she spoke, the worry in his eyes intensifying. "What exactly did you see?" he pressed, his voice urgent, his calm facade slipping as he realized the full weight of her discovery. Amelia relayed what she could remember from the letter, the names, the references to a pending transaction that went beyond a standard investment deal, and the vague but ominous tone that hinted at something criminal, even violent. With every word, Lucas's expression grew more grim, his posture shifting from tense to resolute. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, running a hand through his hair. "I thought they might try something, but this is worse than I'd feared." Amelia felt a shiver run down her spine. "What do you mean?" she asked, sensing that he knew more than he'd previously let on. He glanced around as though confirming their privacy, before leaning in, his voice barely a whisper. "These people, some of the names you mentioned, are more than just financiers. They're part of a network that funds illegal activities under the guise of legitimate investments. And if James is getting involved with them, it's not just risky, it's deadly." Amelia's eyes widened, her fear mingling with a fierce determination. "We have to stop him. If he goes through with this meeting, he'll be in their grip. They won't let him walk away without a price." Lucas nodded, his jaw clenched. "You're right. I underestimated just how far they'd go to secure his involvement. I thought I could keep him from getting entangled, but I didn't expect him to be this stubborn." For a moment, they stood there in the gathering dusk, both realizing the gravity of what lay ahead. Lucas's expression softened as he looked at her, a glimmer of gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you, Amelia. Without you, I wouldn't have known the full extent of what we're dealing with." Amelia felt a small spark of pride, her fear momentarily replaced by a sense of purpose. "So what do we do now?" she asked, bracing herself for whatever came next. Lucas's gaze hardened with resolve. "We have to find a way to expose them and make sure James knows exactly who he's dealing with before it's too late. But we'll need evidence, something concrete. It won't be easy, and it won't be safe." Amelia nodded, unflinching. Whatever dangers lay ahead, she was prepared to face them. After all, she'd come this far. There was no turning back now. The weight of their plan settled between them, silent but powerful, as Amelia and Lucas realized they needed an ally, someone with knowledge, connections, and, most importantly, access to evidence that could expose the network surrounding Mr. Gray. The names on that letter were more than just financiers, as Lucas had said. They were dangerous, and they wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who threatened them. Lucas looked at Amelia, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "There might be one person who can help us," he said, his tone cautious. "But I'm not sure if he's trustworthy. Well, let's just say he has his own interests, and he's close enough to these people to know things we don't." Amelia's mind raced, curiosity and suspicion mingling. She'd learned that alliances in this world often came at a price. "Who is he?" Lucas hesitated, glancing away as if weighing whether he should even mention the name. Finally, he spoke. "Arthur Caldwell. He's a corporate lawyer, a fixer for the wealthy. He handles situations that need to stay out of courtrooms and off the front page. If anyone has dirt on these people, it's him. But trust doesn't come easily with Arthur. He's only loyal to his own interests." Amelia frowned. "So he could just as easily turn us in as help us?" "Exactly." Lucas ran a hand over his face, thinking. "But he owes me a favor, one he can't ignore. If we play this right, he might give us enough information to expose these people, or at least enough to convince James to abandon the deal. It's risky, but he's our best shot." Amelia took a deep breath, nerves twisting in her stomach. She'd been right to be cautious about this world. The deeper they went, the murkier everything became. But she knew they didn't have much choice. They couldn't just leave Mr. Gray in the dark. They couldn't let him walk into a trap when they had the means to stop him. "When can we meet him?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Tonight," Lucas replied, glancing at his watch. "Arthur doesn't like formal meetings. He prefers neutral locations, places where he can feel in control. There's a bar downtown he frequents, the kind that's private enough for these sorts of conversations. I'll set it up." They agreed to meet at the bar later that evening, Lucas telling her to arrive separately to avoid drawing attention. Amelia could barely focus on her tasks for the rest of the day, her thoughts consumed by the risk they were about to take. A meeting with a man as dangerous and calculating as Arthur Caldwell could end disastrously, yet she knew she'd come too far to stop now. When the time came, she dressed in her plainest clothes, hoping to blend in. The bar was tucked into a quiet corner of downtown, its dark, polished exterior giving it an aura of discretion and sophistication. She spotted Lucas at the entrance, a subtle nod the only acknowledgement he gave her before leading her inside. Arthur Caldwell was already waiting at a booth in the back, nursing a glass of amber liquid. He looked every bit the part of a powerful fixer, his dark suit impeccable, his eyes sharp and calculating. As they approached, his gaze flicked to Amelia, a flicker of curiosity flashing across his face before he turned to Lucas with a raised brow. "So this is the favor you're calling in?" Arthur drawled, a hint of amusement in his voice. "I have to admit, I'm curious." Lucas leaned forward, his tone deadly serious. "Arthur, we need information. Information on some very dangerous people James is about to get involved with. You know the types, investors with interests far beyond the legal." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "We need your help to stop him." Arthur's expression remained unreadable, but his gaze sharpened, and he took a slow sip from his glass. "And why would I risk my neck for your altruistic little mission?" Amelia's voice was quiet but resolute as she spoke up, surprising herself. "Because if you don't, people will get hurt, innocent people, including Mr. Gray." She held his gaze, unflinching, willing him to understand the gravity of what they faced. And if these people get what they want, they'll keep expanding, they'll become unstoppable. Arthur studied her, his expression softening ever so slightly as if he recognized something genuine in her plea. With a quiet sigh, he set his glass down and leaned back, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Fine," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too much. "But this information doesn't come free or without risk." Arthur's eyes glinted with a mix of intrigue and warning as he looked between Lucas and Amelia. "Here's the deal," he said, his voice low but firm. "I'll give you access to some information, enough to make James Gray think twice about his new associates. But in return, I need something from you." Lucas's jaw tightened, clearly wary. "What kind of something?" Arthur leaned in, folding his hands casually, though his eyes were anything but. "I have a client," he began, "who's involved in some delicate legal troubles. If I'm going to risk myself for your cause, I need certain documents removed from a safe at James's office. These documents could damage my client's reputation if they're ever discovered, and I trust you to understand the importance of discretion." Amelia's heart skipped. Breaking into Mr. Gray's private safe would be far beyond her usual acts of courage, yet she realized the strange, transactional nature of alliances in this world. To get what they needed, they'd have to step even deeper into dangerous waters. Lucas narrowed his eyes, clearly uncomfortable with the idea. "You're asking us to put ourselves in double jeopardy. And to be clear, if we get caught, there's no way we can protect you." Arthur chuckled softly. "Oh, I don't expect you to, but if you're as serious as you seem about saving your friend from these investors, this is the only way." He paused, glancing at Amelia. "Unless, of course, you're not up for it." Amelia met his gaze without wavering. "If it keeps Mr. Gray safe, I'm in," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. It was clear Arthur was sizing her up, assessing whether she truly had the resolve. Satisfied, he gave a brief nod. "Good. Here's what you'll need to know," Arthur said, slipping a folded sheet of paper across the table. "This is the combination to his secondary safe in the East Study. Inside, you'll find a set of sealed documents marked with the initials HC. Take them, and my information's yours." Lucas exchanged a glance with Amelia, a silent agreement forming between them. They were in this together, for better or worse, and there was no turning back. Arthur's demeanor shifted, becoming more serious as he leaned closer, his tone dropping to an ominous whisper. "As for what you need to show James, his associates' dealings go deep. Offshore accounts, laundering operations, connections to a chain of crime rings. They've groomed him for months, and his cooperation means power and protection for them. They've likely promised him a future beyond what he could achieve alone, but that's a lie. Once he's in, they'll control him." Amelia's stomach twisted. The stakes were higher than she'd imagined. Mr. Gray, unaware of the extent of his new associate's criminal web, was at risk of becoming a pawn in something too dark to escape. Arthur straightened, his face returning to its usual stoic composure. "Give me the documents by tomorrow night. Then, and only then, will I give you the final details to sway James." They stood to leave, and Arthur's gaze lingered on Amelia. "I hope, for your sake, this is worth it," he said quietly, his expression unreadable. Lucas gave Arthur a nod, then ushered Amelia toward the exit, his hand light on her elbow as they left the bar. Outside, the night air was thick with tension, and she felt the full weight of what they'd agreed to. As they walked to her car, Lucas looked over at her, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "You didn't have to do that, you know. Not everyone would have the courage." Amelia managed a small smile, though her heart was pounding. "Maybe not," she replied, "but it felt right. If we can get him the evidence he needs, maybe we can stop this before it's too late." He nodded, the intensity in his expression mirroring her own. "Let's make it count, then." And with that, they shared a determined silence, both resolved to face whatever dangers lay ahead. The following evening arrived faster than Amelia anticipated, and as darkness fell over the Gray's mansion, she felt the weight of her decision settle heavily on her shoulders. With Lucas by her side, they prepared to carry out the plan. The mansion was eerily quiet, its vast rooms and hallways darkened, and every creak in the floorboards sounded magnified, amplifying their anxiety. Amelia had been in the East Study countless times, dusting and organizing Mr. Gray's bookshelves, but tonight the space felt unfamiliar, charged with an intensity that made her pulse race. She and Lucas crept through the house, every shadow seeming to hold its breath as they slipped closer to Mr. Gray's office. She dressed in dark, practical clothes to blend in with the dim light, hoping the combination of familiarity and stealth would keep them unnoticed. Once they reached the study, Lucas signaled her to wait by the door as he quietly slipped inside. He moved with a practiced grace, each step carefully calculated. Amelia held her breath, listening intently for any sound that might signal trouble. Her nerves felt like live wires, but she stayed focused, reminding herself that each step brought them closer to saving Mr. Gray from the sinister network he was tangled in. Lucas gestured for her to follow as he reached the heavy desk that dominated the study's far corner. The secondary safe was concealed behind a shelf of old, leather-bound books. Amelia quickly moved to help him, her hands trembling slightly as they worked together to pull the shelf back just enough to reveal the safe's hidden door. Her fingers brushed the folded paper Arthur had given them, and she silently recited the combination in her head, taking a steadying breath before she knelt down and began to turn the dial. The safe's cold metal chilled her fingers as she entered the combination. Each click felt like a countdown, the silence pressing in on them as she turned the final number. With a quiet hum, the lock released, and she slowly pulled the door open, the soft light from her small flashlight illuminating the safe's contents. Inside, a neat stack of files lay waiting. Amelia spotted the one marked with the initials HC, exactly as Arthur had described. It looked innocuous enough, just a plain folder, yet she knew the documents inside could ruin lives if exposed. Lucas took the file carefully, slipping it into a plain black bag. He met Amelia's gaze, giving a slight nod. "That's it," he whispered. "Let's get out of here." But as they turned, the quiet click of a door opening echoed through the hall, and Amelia's heart dropped. Someone was coming. She looked at Lucas, panic flashing in her eyes, but he held a finger to his lips, urging her to stay calm. They darted to the far side of the study, crouching low behind a heavy velvet curtain that framed one of the tall windows. From their hiding place, Amelia heard footsteps approaching, the soft but distinct sounds of polished shoes against the hardwood floor. She held her breath, clutching the edge of the curtain tightly, praying they'd remain hidden in the shadows. The footsteps grew closer, stopping just short of the safe. Amelia dared a quick glance through a sliver in the curtain and caught sight of Mr. Gray himself. He stood there, his expression unreadable as he stared at the open safe, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. Her pulse raced, a blend of guilt and fear tightening in her chest. In the silence, she felt Lucas's hand on her arm, steadying her, silently urging her to wait. She closed her eyes, counting the seconds as Mr. Gray inspected the safe, seemingly oblivious to their presence, just a few feet away. After what felt like an eternity, Mr. Gray sighed and closed the safe door, adjusting the shelf to cover it once more. With a final, lingering look around the room, he turned and exited, his footsteps echoing down the hall. When the sound of his footsteps faded, Lucas and Amelia let out a quiet breath of relief, exchanging a glance of shared triumph and tension. They'd narrowly avoided disaster, but they weren't out of danger yet. Amelia's hands trembled as she emerged from behind the curtain, still feeling the ghost of her pounding heart as it slowed to a steady beat. Lucas gave her a nod, signaling that they needed to move quickly. The fact that Mr. Gray had come so close to discovering them made every shadow seem sharper, every sound louder. They knew the longer they stayed, the greater the chance of someone realizing they were there. Quietly, they crept out of the study, keeping close to the walls, their senses heightened with the awareness of their fragile success. They slipped down a back hallway, taking a route Amelia knew was rarely used by anyone in the mansion. As they approached the service exit, which led to a side path in the gardens, the rustle of leaves and the soft night air filled her lungs, calming her just enough to clear her mind. But as they rounded a corner toward the exit, a figure stepped into their path. It was one of Mr. Gray's security guards, a man Amelia recognized by sight, though she'd rarely spoken to him. He stared at them in shock, clearly taken aback to see two people emerging from a hallway where no one was supposed to be. His eyes narrowed suspiciously as he looked them over. "Evening," he said, his tone guarded. "What are you two doing here?" Lucas responded quickly, his voice calm and unruffled. "We're here on Mr. Gray's orders, just taking care of a small matter for him. We're on our way out now." He gave the guard a casual nod, the hint of authority in his tone unmistakable. The guard hesitated, clearly uncertain, but Amelia could see the flicker of recognition in his eyes as he processed Lucas's response. Lucas's reputation preceded him, and the guard seemed unwilling to challenge him directly. Still, his eyes drifted to Amelia, and she felt a surge of anxiety as he seemed to take in her unfamiliar presence. "You're the cleaner, right?" he asked her, a hint of doubt in his voice. "Didn't know you worked this late." Amelia swallowed, but she nodded smoothly, holding his gaze with what she hoped looked like confidence. "Yes," she replied. Mr. Gray asked me to help Mr. Moretti with some files. It's not a usual task, but she trailed off, hoping her words were enough to satisfy him. The guard seemed to weigh her response, his eyes flicking between the two of them, lingering on the bag Lucas carried. For a tense moment, Amelia thought he might question them further, might even demand to see what was in the bag. But then, with a reluctant shrug, he stepped aside, signaling them to pass. "All right," he said, though his tone still held an edge of suspicion. "But make it quick. Mr. Gray doesn't usually like people roaming around after hours." Lucas nodded. "Understood. We're on our way." They moved past him, and as they reached the exit, Amelia let out a quiet sigh of relief, her pulse finally beginning to slow. Outside, the night air was cool, filled with the scent of fresh grass and the whisper of the wind through the trees. They walked in silence through the gardens until they reached the side gate, slipping out and into the quiet street beyond. Once they were safely outside the mansion grounds, Lucas stopped and looked at Amelia, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. "We did it," he murmured, his tone equal parts amazement and relief. "For a minute there, I thought we were done for." Amelia allowed herself a small smile, though the adrenaline still pulsed through her. "So did I," she admitted, "but we got what we needed." Lucas held up the bag containing the documents with a grim smile. "Now we just need to get these to Arthur and hope he keeps his end of the bargain. With this, we might finally have the leverage to make James see the truth about his so-called partners." Amelia nodded, her mind already racing with what was to come. They'd taken the first step, but she knew their journey was far from over. Whatever lay ahead, they'd need every ounce of courage, trust, and strength they could muster to bring this dangerous game to an end. The following night, Amelia and Lucas met Arthur Caldwell in a dimly lit, private room at a hotel lounge. The air was thick with tension, and the scent of polished leather and expensive cologne lingered as they slid into the booth across from him. Arthur looked relaxed, leaning back with his fingers laced together as if he were simply meeting old friends. But his gaze sharpened when Lucas placed the black bag with the documents on the table. "Tell me you got everything," Arthur murmured, his eyes glittering with interest. Lucas nodded, his expression resolute. "It's all here. Now you promised us the details we need to expose Gray's associates and make him understand the risk he's facing." Arthur's hand moved to the bag, lifting the documents with careful precision. He didn't rush, flipping through the pages with the casual ease of someone who was accustomed to dealing with secrets, his expression unreadable. For a few agonizing minutes, Amelia and Lucas sat in silence, the room thick with anticipation. At last, Arthur closed the file, his mouth set in a thin line. "Well," he said, his voice low, "what you're dealing with here is more than just a network of shady investors. These people form the core of an organization with connections to everything from offshore laundering operations to arms trafficking. They target men like James Gray, people with clean records but ambitious goals, and promise them the world, only to entrap them." Amelia's stomach twisted. She had suspected the network was dangerous, but hearing it spelled out confirmed just how deep Mr. Gray was falling into this dark web. "Can we make James understand the seriousness of this? Show him how much is at stake?" Arthur glanced at her, a glint of something like sympathy in his usually impassive gaze. "It's not that simple. Men like James think they're invincible until they're in too deep. But," he continued, his tone shifting to something more hopeful, "this file, combined with what I know, might just be enough to shock him out of it." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small flash drive, sliding it across the table toward Lucas. "On this drive, you'll find detailed accounts of their operations, payments, transaction records, even correspondence linking key players to illegal activities. Use it wisely, and you might save him." Lucas took the drive with a nod of gratitude, slipping it into his jacket. "Thank you, Arthur," he said, his tone sincere despite the circumstances. Arthur gave a dismissive wave. "Just remember, if this ever gets traced back to me, it'll be both your heads, not mine. I've given you what you need, but now the real work begins." They left the hotel with the drive in hand, feeling a renewed sense of urgency. The next challenge was persuading Mr. Gray to review the evidence and realize the peril he was in. The following morning, Amelia and Lucas met in a quiet cafe before work. They rehearsed their approach, knowing that every word, every detail would matter. They agreed that Lucas would handle the technical details, while Amelia would reinforce the personal side, the deep concern she felt as someone who had been close enough to witness his shift and knew the potential loss all too well. By midday, the plan was set, and they returned to the mansion, both feeling the weight of what lay ahead. As they entered, they were greeted by Mr. Gray's assistant, who seemed visibly surprised to see them together. Lucas requested a private audience with Mr. Gray, insisting it was urgent. In his office, Mr. Gray looked at them, his expression curious but guarded. "This better be important," he said, his tone cool. "It is," Lucas replied, pulling out the flash drive and the documents. "James, you're in danger. The people you're dealing with, this investment, it's far more dangerous than you realize. We have proof, and you need to see it." Mr. Gray's face darkened, but he didn't protest. Amelia watched his expression carefully, praying he would hear them out. If he rejected their warning now, there would be no second chances. Mr. Gray's eyes narrowed as Lucas slid the flash drive and documents across the desk. His gaze flicked from the items to Lucas and Amelia, a guarded skepticism evident in his expression. "This feels like an ambush," he said slowly, his tone hardening. "I'm not in the habit of having my decisions questioned." Lucas met his gaze, his voice unwavering. "I know how this looks, James, but we wouldn't be here if it wasn't necessary. These people are criminals, and they're using you. They'll destroy you, and they won't lose a wink of sleep over it." Mr. Gray looked down at the documents, a hint of doubt finally breaking through his armor. Amelia felt her breath catch, sensing the importance of this moment. She knew she had to say something, something that would cut through his defenses and reach him as a person, not just a powerful man at the top of his game. "Mr. Gray," she said softly, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "I know I'm not someone you expect to hear this from, but I care about what happens to you. I've seen this kind of ruin before. They'll take everything from you, your reputation, your freedom, even your life, if it serves their purpose. Lucas and I are here because we want to stop that from happening." For a moment, Mr. Gray just looked at her, an expression of quiet surprise on his face. He seemed taken aback by her words, by the genuine concern in her voice. Amelia held his gaze, willing him to believe her. Finally, he exhaled, a flicker of resignation passing through his eyes. "Show me," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Lucas moved quickly, plugging the flash drive into the laptop on Mr. Gray's desk. They watched as files opened on the screen, spreadsheets detailing suspicious transactions, emails linking his potential partners to corrupt officials, and offshore accounts filled with the dirty money that funded a network of illegal activities spanning multiple continents. It was all there, laid bare in cold, incriminating evidence. As Mr. Gray scrolled through the files, his face grew pale, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. The disbelief turned to anger, and finally, a deep, unsettled fear as he understood the full scope of the trap closing around him. This can't be," he murmured, more to himself than to them. They promised it was above board, that everything was legal. Amelia felt a pang of sympathy, seeing the vulnerability behind his once impenetrable facade. She knew this revelation was shaking him to his core, confronting him with a reality he'd been unwilling to see. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, and he looked up, his expression one of raw disbelief. "I didn't want to believe it either," she said softly. "But you have to. These people don't make promises. They make traps, and you're too valuable for them to let go." Lucas nodded, his voice filled with urgency. "James, we need to act. This network is well connected, and once they know you're not fully on board, they'll tighten their grip. We need to expose them before they have a chance to retaliate." Mr. Gray's jaw tightened, his eyes hardening as he processed the gravity of their words. Slowly, he nodded, determination replacing the fear in his gaze. "You're right," he said, his voice steadier. "If I go along with them, I'm done, but if I expose them, maybe I can get out of this before it's too late." He looked at both of them, gratitude mingling with a fierce resolve. "Thank you," he said, his voice softening. "I didn't see this coming, but you two, you saved me from making the biggest mistake of my life." Amelia felt relief wash over her, but she knew the fight wasn't over yet. Exposing such powerful people wouldn't be easy, and the risks were higher than ever. But for the first time, they had a chance, a real chance, to end the nightmare before it could take Mr. Gray down. As they prepared to put their plan into action, Amelia felt a strange, unexpected pride swelling within her. She wasn't just the cleaning lady anymore. She was part of something bigger, and together they would see this through to the end. The following days were a blur of high-stakes maneuvers as Mr. Gray, Amelia, and Lucas worked in tandem to expose the network's dealings without alerting anyone prematurely. It was a delicate game of strategy and timing, and they had to be sure of every move. Amelia stayed close to Mr. Gray, providing assistance whenever she could, while Lucas worked from the shadows, coordinating with Arthur to identify safe contacts in law enforcement who could be trusted with the information. The weight of the task was heavy, but the end was finally in sight. Late one evening, Mr. Gray sat down with Amelia in his office, the two of them exhausted but resolute. He looked at her, the guarded, distant demeanor he'd once had now softened by respect and gratitude. "I owe you a debt I can't repay, Amelia," he said quietly. "Without you, I would have walked right into their trap, completely blind. You've been braver than I ever gave you credit for." Amelia shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Gray. Just promise me that if we make it through this, you'll stay clear of people like that. It's not worth it." He nodded solemnly, his gaze steady. "I will. I've seen where this path leads, and it's nothing I want a part of." The final piece of their plan came together with Arthur's help. He arranged a meeting with a trusted federal investigator, someone high enough up to ensure protection, but discreet enough to avoid tipping off the network's inner circle. The investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Agent Patel, had a reputation for being tough, ethical, and relentless in cases involving high-profile crime networks. With her on their side, they had a chance to bring the whole operation crashing down. The next morning, Amelia, Mr. Gray, and Lucas met Agent Patel in an unmarked office downtown. She listened intently as they laid out the evidence, her face a mask of concentration as she examined the documents and the flash drive. When they finished, she leaned back, her eyes filled with a grim satisfaction. "This is solid," she said. "If we move quickly, we can freeze their assets and arrest several of their key players before they realize what's happening. We'll be able to sever their network and keep them from retaliating against you." She turned to Mr. Gray. "But this is going to be public. Your name will be tied to the investigation, at least initially. Are you prepared for that?" Mr. Gray's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Yes, if it means shutting these people down, I'll face whatever comes." Amelia felt a swell of admiration for him. This was a side of Mr. Gray she hadn't seen, a willingness to face consequences for his mistakes, and a resolve to correct the damage he'd nearly caused. The transformation was undeniable, and she realized he was someone capable of change, of breaking free from the shadows he'd almost willingly entered. Agent Patel left them with strict instructions and a promise of confidentiality until the arrests were made. Amelia watched as she walked away, a sense of closure beginning to settle over her. They had done it. What had once seemed an insurmountable threat was finally under control, and she, Lucas, and Mr. Gray had emerged stronger, bound by the strange circumstances that had brought them together. As they left the office, Mr. Gray stopped and turned to her, his face softened by a quiet, genuine gratitude. "Amelia, I can't imagine what made you decide to get involved, but I'm grateful that you did. You saw something in me worth saving, and I won't forget it." She felt her heart lighten. "You're welcome, Mr. Gray. We all make mistakes, but it's how we face them that counts." With the network on the verge of collapse and justice in sight, Amelia knew that they'd succeeded in stopping a terrible force, and that, perhaps for the first time, her life had changed others in ways she could never have imagined. 2 weeks later, the fallout from the network's collapse rippled through the city. News broke that federal agents had dismantled an extensive criminal organization responsible for money laundering, fraud, and even more sinister activities. Arrests were made across the country, freezing assets and shuttering offshore accounts that funded the organization's illegal enterprises. Amelia read each article in quiet awe, seeing names she recognized from the documents and emails flash across the headlines. Her actions, once so small and unassuming, had helped bring down an empire built on exploitation and corruption. In the days following the arrests, Mr. Gray found himself in the spotlight, albeit briefly. True to Agent Patel's word, he was initially tied to the investigation, a position he faced head-on. At a brief press conference, Mr. Gray made a short, prepared statement, taking responsibility for his nearly fatal misstep in aligning with the organization. With a quiet dignity, he spoke of the lessons he had learned, vowing to work openly and ethically from that moment forward. Watching the coverage from the comfort of her home, Amelia felt a surge of pride. He had kept his promise, to her, to himself, and to the people who had been unknowingly affected by his choices. A few days after his public statement, Amelia received an unexpected visitor. She opened her door to find a luxury car parked outside her modest home, with Mr. Gray stepping out, carrying a small box. He was dressed simply, his usual airs of wealth stripped away. As he approached her, he looked almost like a friend, someone grateful and humbled. "May I come in?" he asked, a gentle smile on his face. She welcomed him in, leading him to her modest living room. The sight of Mr. Gray in her home felt surreal, a jarring but fitting end to their shared journey. He handed her the box, his expression earnest. "I wanted to give you something," he said, his tone soft. "A small token, though it hardly feels enough for what you did for me." Amelia opened the box, revealing an elegant silver necklace, the pendant a simple, beautiful shape, a feather, delicate and unassuming, much like herself. "It's lovely," she murmured, touched by the gesture. "But you didn't have to do this." "I did," he insisted gently, "because you reminded me that people, no matter where they're from or what role they play, have power. You didn't have to care, but you did, and that made all the difference." They shared a quiet moment, an understanding passing between them that transcended words. In that moment, Amelia felt the weight of the past lift, her brother's memory, her years of quiet invisibility. She had taken a risk that had led her down a path of courage she'd never known herself to possess. And now, she stood here, changed and validated, knowing she'd helped dismantle something terrible. Mr. Gray looked around her home, his gaze settling on a photograph of her brother on the mantel. "Thank you for giving me the chance to change," he said quietly. "I don't know if I would have listened if it hadn't been for you." Amelia smiled, the pain in her heart transforming into something soft and bittersweet. "Sometimes," she replied, "we just need someone to remind us who we can be." With a final grateful look, Mr. Gray departed, leaving her standing in her small but cozy home, the necklace in her hand, a symbol of all that had changed. She felt a deep sense of peace and purpose that she hadn't felt in years, a quiet promise that she would carry forward. As she watched his car disappear down the road, Amelia knew she had closed a chapter of her life, yet opened herself to a new one. She was no longer invisible, no longer just a part of the background. She had found her voice, her courage, and a renewed purpose, a reminder that her compassion, her quiet strength, had the power to change lives, including her own. After Mr. Gray left, Amelia stood in her quiet living room, the silver necklace resting in her hand, shimmering in the soft light. The delicate feather pendant felt light yet heavy with meaning, a symbol of her journey through fear, courage, and the discovery of her own strength. She ran her thumb over the smooth surface, feeling an odd, comforting warmth spread through her, a mixture of peace and resilience she hadn't felt in years. For so long, she had gone unnoticed, living in the periphery of others' lives, convinced that her quiet existence mattered little in the grand scheme of things. Yet, she had found herself at the center of a series of events that had brought down powerful people, protected the vulnerable, and helped a man like Mr. Gray rediscover his integrity. And perhaps she'd found herself along the way. As the days passed, Amelia returned to her routines, though her perspective had shifted. She looked at her simple home with renewed appreciation, finding solace in the modesty of her life. A life unburdened by ambition that cut corners, alliances that corrupted, or wealth that came at any cost. Her job, once something she'd performed with quiet detachment, now felt meaningful in a way she hadn't anticipated. Every room she cleaned, every small interaction she had, reminded her that her role in the world, however modest, was important. She was a part of people's lives, a witness to their stories, and sometimes, as she had learned, even a catalyst for change. But the journey had also shown her that she was ready for more. She thought of Manuel, of the life he'd wanted but never found. And she thought of herself, not as the sister in mourning, but as Amelia, a woman capable of choosing her own path. Her brother had chased a future too quickly, rushing towards something unsustainable, but she realized that the future she wanted didn't have to be defined by shadows or regrets. With that realization, she found herself daring to imagine new possibilities. She'd always loved reading and learning, and she'd always had an interest in working with others, perhaps in social work or with community organizations. Though her life had been modest, she'd quietly saved over the years, and now she saw that she had the means to take the next step, to build a life beyond the predictable and safe. One evening, after a long day's work, Amelia sat at her small kitchen table, a notebook open before her. For the first time, she began writing down goals, exploring ideas she'd never given herself permission to dream of. Each word she wrote down felt like a promise to herself. She'd lived in the background for so long, but now she was ready to step forward. The necklace around her neck, she realized, felt like more than a gift. It was a reminder of what she could do when she embraced her own courage. It reminded her that while she might still choose a quiet life, it would be a life filled with purpose, shaped by her values and her dreams. She could make a difference in small, steady ways, ways that mattered to her. In the weeks that followed, she began looking into local classes and community organizations, searching for ways to get involved. She felt a growing excitement, a stirring of ambition that was less about achievement and more about fulfillment. She was ready to embrace this next chapter, whatever it held, with the strength and quiet determination that had guided her through the storm. As autumn settled over the city, Amelia felt a sense of peace and anticipation she hadn't known in years. The leaves had turned to vibrant reds and golds, a reminder of change and resilience, and she found herself drawn to the comforting rituals of the season. She had registered for a night class in social work, her first step toward a life where she could help others more directly. It was a small but meaningful leap into a world she once thought was closed to her. Her routine at the Gray's mansion resumed with a familiarity, yet everything felt slightly altered. She saw Mr. Gray less often, as he'd taken time off from his business dealings to reassess his path. When their paths did cross, however, he treated her with a quiet warmth and respect, as though they shared a bond few could understand. On more than one occasion, he'd stopped her to ask for her perspective on something, valuing her insight in a way that never ceased to surprise her. She appreciated the moments, sensing that he, too, was finding a way to rebuild his life on new, solid ground. One crisp afternoon, she returned home to find a letter in her mailbox, bearing the elegant logo of a small community center nearby. It was an invitation to interview for a part-time position assisting with their community outreach programs, a role she'd applied for on a whim a few weeks earlier. Her heart leaped as she read it. She had thought the job a long shot, her experience unconventional, yet here she was, being considered for something that aligned perfectly with her new goals. She couldn't help but feel that everything was falling into place, as though the universe was rewarding her bravery. On the day of the interview, she wore the silver feather necklace, tucking it carefully under her blouse as a quiet reminder of the journey that had brought her here. She was nervous, her hands shaking slightly as she stepped into the modest building where the center was located. The interview was informal, held over a cup of coffee with the center's director, a woman named Laura who radiated warmth and kindness. They spoke about the challenges facing the local community and the ways the center offered support, from food drives to after-school programs and outreach to isolated seniors. Amelia felt a spark as she described her passion for the work, sharing the quiet skills she'd honed over years of listening and observing, of being there in the background, supporting people's lives in small, often unseen ways. Laura listened intently, nodding thoughtfully as Amelia spoke of her desire to make a difference, however modest. She left the interview with a feeling of contentment, knowing that, regardless of the outcome, she had taken a step toward the life she wanted. A few days later, the call came. She had the job. The news filled her with joy, a quiet but profound satisfaction that came from knowing she was finally living in alignment with her purpose. She was no longer defined by invisibility or her losses, but by the strength she'd found within herself. Amelia took the position eagerly, balancing her new role with her cleaning work, grateful for every small opportunity to touch lives and contribute to something larger than herself. On her first day at the community center, as she helped unpack food donations and greeted volunteers, she felt the warmth of a new beginning, a life rooted in purpose and connection. The silver feather necklace caught a glint of sunlight, resting near her heart as a constant reminder of the strength that had brought her here. In the quiet, unassuming ways that had always defined her, Amelia had become more than just a witness to the lives around her. She had become a part of them, a source of quiet change and steady kindness. Her journey, filled with hardship and courage, had transformed her, and now she embraced the world not as someone overlooked, but as a person who made her mark in subtle, lasting ways. Her story, she knew, was only just beginning.